Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaste. In this lecture number 5, before we move on to next stage in our discussion, it is worth recapitulating some of the key aspects of the methodological engagements in the classical sociology that we discussed in the previous lecture. We revisited the Trinity, Durkheim, Marx and Weber, with specific eye at their respective way of seeing, at their methodological engagement. Each is distinct despite some of the shared concerns. Durkheim takes us in one direction by stressing on how one looks at social facts as things and how social things presupposes a way of seeing in order to be scientific. Marx refashions a historically materialist sense of empiricism, which could pull off together both an epistemological break from the after effects of enlightenment as well as a political plan for transformative struggle, transformative politics. Both Durkheim and Marx critically engaged with empiricism while struggling against phantoms. Phantoms, which are perceptions, the Baconian idols of mind. They both, Marx and Durkheim, tend to do some fist fight, intellectual fist fight with these Baconian idols of mind. Weber adds excruciating details of motives, meanings, understanding, the bricks and mortars in the methodological body that Weber presents. He underlines the need of value neutrality a little too emphatically. There is a qualitatively intriguing struggle against the phantom of mind in Weber's scheme of analysis, as Weber adopts the Kantian premise and acknowledges the significance of everything that could be irrational or non-rational in ultimate analysis. They all figure in some way or other in the scheme of analysis that Weber is trying to present. In each way of seeing, there is negotiation with and critical revisiting of predecessors. There are notes of departure in each strand of thought, marshaled for a way of seeing, yet they all, in the Trinity, expect the performance of extraordinary from the seekers of knowledge and doers of sciences. Each invites us to fight against the phantoms, idols of mind, camera obscura, subjective meanings, all those things which are inaccessible to rational reworking, to rational scientific epistemology. Everything that can be common with the ordinary folk turns out to be suspicious in these ways of seeing. These ways of seeing, befitting the larger positivistic framework, would like to dismiss things which belong to ordinary folk. Paradoxically, this is despite a clear bent of each way of seeing to the ordinary human's worldview. Each of these in the Trinity in classical sociology tries to offer us an approach to the ordinary world and some idea as to how to deal with this ordinariness of the world. However, each arrives at a milestone, a destination which are of extraordinary nature. Non-experts are so clearly separated from experts as they are in the laboratory bound natural sciences. So, a replica of natural sciences emerges within social sciences if we engage with the methodological discussions available in the trinity in classical social sciences. Each seeks to create a science of society which aspires to arrive at indubitable, in typically Cartesian sense, indubitable truth claim, certain truth claim, and generalizable principles. They all participate in the larger than life paradigm named positivism. However, we also noticed that positivism for Marx and Durkheim is a scientific method for reconstructing the social world, whereas Weber works on and with positivism towards emancipation from any emancipatory agenda. Weber, in a way, tries to make it more matter of factly in spite of his engagement with the things which are related to the faculty of intuition, ideas which appear in the sensational body of a scholar, ideas which may not have scientific verification, they also figure in Weberian methodological discussion. And yet Weber works with on the frame of positivism. He engages with scientific epistemology in order to bring about emancipation for social sciences from any emancipatory agenda. This brief recapitulation that I have just now shared with you shall add that positivism in social science, informed by and engaged with scientific epistemology, perpetuated the supremacy of science. It did not diminish the supremacy of science. It did not critically question the supremacy of science. It never departed from many of the fundamental features of scientific epistemology, including the nature and scope, universalism and generalization of laws, etc., etc. Science was not questioned as such in the classical social science. The questioning happens with the dispute. So, in this lecture, we would try to understand the significance of the dispute, the layers of the dispute, the richness of this intellectual dispute, which compels us without any choice to revisit the category of science, and in the light of that revisiting, rethink the idea of social science, rethink our methodological apparatus within social science. So, what is positivist dispute? What happens within it? Before getting on with the main dispute, it ought to be noted that there has been a tradition of disputes in modern social sciences. This tradition of disputes in modern social sciences can have certain kind of inspiration from so-called non-modern or pre-modern traditions of intellectual debates. Traditions of intellectual debates bring about several episodes of scholars, philosophers entering in duel. There are varieties of systematic ways of public debates among scholars of Mimamsa philosophy, Nyaya philosophy, Buddhist epistemologists. They all indulged themselves in the context of South Asia in civilizational setup, in historical setup, they all indulged in severe criticism, logical argumentation against each other. Those public debates were reflective of a very rich tradition of entering in debates which are otherwise not so common these days because of the intellectual politics of certain kind, because of the regime of power of certain kind. We do not know, we cannot be conclusive as to what are the reasons which scuttle our age-old traditions of intellectual disputes. It is in that kind of situation that a dispute in social science, modern social sciences, becomes so crucial for us today. In a way, classical sociological engagement that we discussed in the previous lecture also showed the possibility of dispute. In a way, positivism, in a way, is a mild version of dispute with empiricism and the Enlightenment rationalism, in a very mild way, no doubt. As it was indicated, positivist framework runs short of alternatives in the wake of a predominant scientific epistemology. Many of the classical sociologists gave us very clear indication that there is need to critically engage with the offerings, the wisdom, the propositions, the arguments of the predecessors in the Enlightenment movement, as well as some of those predecessors who became the forerunners of modern social sciences. And these classical thinkers have adequately shown us as to how to critically engage with them, how to negotiate with them, and then move forward in the framework of positivism. They have enriched the framework of positivism by ensuring that positivism is not plain and simple replica of scientific epistemology. However, they also do not upset the fundamentals of scientific epistemology, and this is what we have seen in the previous lectures. And hence, a dispute with and about positivism is instrumental. A dispute on the characteristics of science became prominent with the positivist dispute in Germany. There was precedence of dispute in the past too. Perhaps most decisive for social sciences was a discussion in 1909 that underlined the possibility and limits of a normative social and economic science. Someone like Knapp and Max Weber, among others, argued whether it is important for economics in particular and in social science in general to participate in the political life. Weber was of the view that scientific activity shall stay above the political activities. But the positivist dispute, also known as the positivism debate in German sociology in the decade of 1960s, gave birth to new possibilities. Seemingly, the making of the dispute comes into picture with the formation of a particular school of thought, famously known as the Frankfurt School, which was contemporary of the Vienna Circle. We had touched upon the logical positivism of Vienna Circle in the previous lecture. And coming back to Frankfurt School, it exhibited critical engagement with the logical positivism of Vienna School. It, in a very sophisticated theoretical manner, Frankfurt School expressed its discomfort with the logical positivism. In the 1930s, Max Horkheimer had set the stage by showing that the Vienna Circle had brought about a culmination in the compromise on reason. Vienna Circle and its version of logical positivism was like the end of the compromise on reason. After that, something else had to be done. Even though one cannot discredit the significant skepticism, for example, of David Hume, and the philosophical interest in the idea of intellectual rationalism that characterized the Enlightenment, there was sufficient evidence of the anomalies of science, scientific way of seeing, and the poor clones such as several disciplines in social sciences trying to emulate the methodological orientation of science, natural sciences, trying to emulate scientific epistemology. In an address as the director of Frankfurt School in 1931, Max Horkheimer trained the gun at those who thought the role of philosophy was over. And he was basically targeting the Vienna Circle, which was strongly in favor of logical positivism without any kind of philosophical interjection, without any kind of ideational interjection. It was Vienna Circle's logical positivism was almost like fact for fact's sake, without any kind of interpretative engagement with the fact. Vienna Circle's logical positivism was almost like this dictum that let the fact speak for itself. And that is what is being disputed when Max Horkheimer says that role of philosophy is not over, and a predominant version of logical positivism coming from Vienna Circle, which says that it would not allow philosophy to have any role in understanding society. That kind of proposition is being ridiculed and dismissed by Max Horkheimer when he says that role of philosophy is not over. Instead, he emphasized the role of the scholars of the Frankfurt School. As a director, he is delivering this address to orient and invite those scholars who are part of Frankfurt School. And he considers it the role and responsibility of the scholars of Frankfurt School. The responsibility is in building up social philosophy as a profound return in social science, making social philosophy as an important premise of social science. And this entailed a critical posture to positivism in general and sociological inquiries in particular. As Horkheimer observed, and I share it in a long quote, Horkheimer says, "For positivism, everything is exhausted in mere facts. These facts, demonstrable with the means of analytic science, are not questioned by philosophy. In contrast, the various viewpoints which maintain the existence of such entities appear simply as another worldview, another metaphysics, or another consciousness, without any possibility of a valid resolution of the matter. One might say that several concepts of reality are involved. It would be possible to investigate the genesis of these different concepts, or to which kind of innate sensibility or social group they correspond, but one cannot be preferred to another on substantive grounds. Now, it is precisely in this dilemma of social philosophy, quote continues, now it is precisely in this dilemma of social philosophy, this inability to speak of its object, namely the cultural life of humanity, other than in ideological, sectarian and confessional terms. The inclination to see in the social theories of Auguste Comte, Karl Marx, Max Weber and Max Scheler differences in articles of faith rather than differences in true, false, or at least problematic theories. It is in this dilemma that we find the difficulty that must be overcome. Of course, the simultaneous existence and validity of various concepts of reality is an indication of the contemporary intellectual situation as a whole. But this variety is rooted in different areas of knowledge and spheres of life, not in one and the same object domain. Thus, for instance, the constitutive categories of philology and of physics may diverge today so greatly that it appears difficult to bring them under one hat. But within physics itself, indeed, within the sciences of inorganic nature as a whole, no such tendency exists to develop irreconcilable concepts of reality. The opposite is the case. Here, the corrective is supplied by concrete research on the object. Quote ends. It's a long quote from the speech delivered by Horkheimer, and this quote anticipates critical comprehension of the classical masters' philosophies, and it also anticipates an action plan for the group of scholars who did not take positivism for granted. This was also noted in other works of Horkheimer, and the essay on dialectic of enlightenment that Horkheimer co-authored with Adorno. Both Adorno and Horkheimer tried showing arguably that the basic category of reason was misplaced in scientific epistemology and its social science cognate positivism. It's the social science cognate of scientific epistemology, which is positivism, did no effort, offers no effort to bring back that misplaced category famously known as reason. They both emphasized that reason is embedded, not disembedded, is embedded in socio-political situation and resources, and hence an abstract philosophical entity, a disembedded entity called reason, is only an eyewash created by philosophers of previous age. The Frankfurt School, therefore, since its early days, began to hint a dispute in the making. But one should not mention this trajectory of a dispute in the making, this trajectory given by the school, Frankfurt School. One should not mention only this trajectory, one should also simultaneously take a look at a significant philosopher of science named Karl Popper. One has to think of Karl Popper in the same breath as one is thinking of Frankfurt School, because Karl Popper is a coveted target in the dispute raised by the proponents of critical theory later in the decade of 1960s. 30 years later, in 1960s, a formal dispute starts, but 30 years before 1960, 30 years before the formal dispute, the beans are being spilled, the calls are being made, the calls for the dispute are being made almost. Popper is also important because his Logic der Forschung, also known as Logic of Scientific Discovery, which had come in the decade of 1930s, a significant work, a significant book which had come in the decade of 1930s, and it was much discussed since 1934. It is because of this work a lot of things start happening. In the light of this work of Popper, one learned what Popper was trying to offer, and Popper considered all the activities that displace metaphysics or such sources in the name of science as pseudoscience. Pretty radical for Popper. For a rationalist philosopher, Karl Popper, it's quite radical statement that he makes, that all activities that displace metaphysics or such sources in the name of science, they are pseudoscience. Be it Marxism, and he names them, Popper names them, be it Marxism or psychoanalysis of Sigmund Freud, be it the body of thought coming from Karl Marx or the body of thought coming from the practices and ruminations by Dr. Sigmund Freud. In both, there is a lack of risk taking equivalent of, say for example, physics. In both Marxism and psychoanalysis, there is this lack of confidence that we see in, say for example, in the field of physical sciences, in physics. Instead, the pseudoscience's prerequisite is a converted follower, a quasi-religious status. Pseudosciences they derive their credibility from a dedicated, already converted followers. Pseudosciences derive their legitimacy from a quasi-religious status. Hence, what they perform mostly is accumulation of corroborating evidences. They consciously accumulate evidences which will prove their thesis. They consciously accumulate confirmation of the theory dear to them. They do it pretty self-consciously, following their own agenda and objectives. They go on accumulating verification of their theory in the light of the suitable evidences. Popper presents an elaborate thesis in which modern science is seen as emerging from optimistic epistemology. If following this optimistic epistemology, according to Popper, it was suggested, following this optimistic epistemology, it was suggested that man can know, thus he can be free. I am quoting Popper. Man can know, thus he can be free. This is optimistic epistemology. It has a great deal of faith in humanity, humanity's ability to know and therefore be free. This was when epistemology was not impotent. This was when epistemology had an array of philosophers from Plato who would give a theory of anamnesis, or Francis Bacon who would give a theory of veracitas naturae, or René Descartes who would follow a theory of veracitas Dei, to further down Bertrand Russell, Immanuel Kant. All of them dwelt upon some kind of optimistic epistemology, holding human capable and possible to achieve freedom. But this optimism was paradoxically enough faced with an epistemological pessimism. Karl Popper highlights this Janus-faced epistemological position in the modern Western philosophy. On one hand, there is this optimism that humans can, on the other hand, there is a pessimism that humans are essentially depraved and incapable of self-regulation. From humans can, we come to this point, which is equally an essential part of the scientific epistemology, that humans are depraved, they can't regulate themselves. They join in the Hobbesian war of one against the other. There is a jump from Plato's Meno or Republic or Phaedrus that reveals the pessimism. The divine man with essence, knowledge, the Platonic divine man with essence becomes prisoners of cave. Prisoners of cave? Ignorance. Prisoners of ignorance. This is seen in Francis Bacon as well as in René Descartes, who on one hand would celebrate inherent ability of men and meanwhile propose to cleanse of doxa, idols or sensations of body. We see in them a hierarchy of sense organs appearing, a hierarchy of the unit of knowledge appearing, a hierarchy of epistemes appearing, and that hierarchy is being underlined here by Karl Popper. Hence, a resplendent authoritarian theory emerged because of this paradoxical epistemological understanding of the men's ability. A resplendent, I am using the word of Karl Popper, a resplendent authoritarian theory emerged to support an epistemological and concomitantly, consequently, political authority to regulate the envisaged vulnerability of mankind. Because humans are vulnerable, hence authority needed. That authority can act as scientific authority in a scientific institution. That authority can act as a scientific authority, as a political authority in a political institution. That authority can also act as social authority in social institutions. However, the point is that there is supposed to be an authority which is rational enough to regulate these vulnerable men and put them on the path of knowing and getting free. So, the interplay of epistemological optimism and epistemological pessimism brings about the birth of an unquestionable, sort of unquestionable authority. Due to such a dual epistemology, we are split into a human part, we ourselves, the part which is the source of our fallible opinions, doxa, the part which is our errors, the part which is our ignorance. This is one part. We are split into two parts. One part has all those things which would not be suitable to the framework of science. One part which is not suitable for the list of normativity dear to most of the authorities, and there is another part which is a superhuman part, such as the sense of the intellect, intellectual supremacy, the sources of real knowledge, episteme, whose authority over us is almost divine. So, there is this mortal part which is very vulnerable, and there is almost this immortal part which is held pristine, pure, unquestionable. Humanity is divided. There is this split created, epistemological split created about mankind. Karl Popper proposes a way of seeing as he develops critical rationalism, distinguishable from the rationalism or intellectualism of René Descartes and Immanuel Kant. Critical rationalism aids in detecting and eliminating errors by, as Popper says, by criticizing the theories or guesses of others and that of our own. This is an ability. Critical rationalism is a kind of ability that makes one admit what? In Karl Popper's word, this ability makes one admit, I do not know. My assertion was merely a guess. I am quoting Karl Popper. Critical rationalism is an ability which enables us to admit what? Karl Popper says, admit that I do not know, my assertion was merely a guess. This is too much of self-confidence which is required to say this. This is the way to rescue science from pseudosciences. Pseudosciences which operate with the idea of inductivism and verification do not offer us this possibility of merging the gap between the epistemologically split personality of mankind. Pseudosciences fail us. This was very briefly, in very broad sense, what Karl Popper was trying to offer, and this became a source of information for those who wanted to engage with Karl Popper in the next 30-40 years. As I told you, in the decade of 1930s, Karl Popper was already being engaged in debates in the Vienna Circle scholars. The logical positivists from Vienna Circle wanted to take interest in Karl Popper, thinking that he is in support of logical positivism. He is in support of logical positivism, and Popper's thesis is against a variety of positivism which is not as pure as Vienna Circle's logical positivism. And under that misunderstanding, there was some engagement by Vienna Circle with Popper's thesis, only however to realize that no, Popper is critical of positivism in general. Popper is critical of the scientific epistemology which has given birth to pseudosciences, and therefore Popper becomes the main philosopher to engage with for some of those sociologists in Germany who wanted to formalize this debate in the decade of 1960s. So, what is the dispute? Popper's critique of logical positivism as well as the questionable tendencies in social sciences resurfaced in his presentation of 27 theses on the logic of social sciences. He was invited in a conference of the German Sociological Association at Tübingen in October 1961. Adorno presented his counter thesis following the presentation of Popper's thesis. Ralph Dahrendorf, another sociologist, was the chair of the symposium, and he delivered remarks on both the presentations. Popper was requested by the organizers of this conference to present his thesis in points and not get into philosophical discourse, which is very usual of the philosophers. So, Popper very methodically, systematically presented a 27-point thesis, mostly targeting the logic of social sciences. This was the beginning of the dispute, which also continued later on. Another round of debate as part of the same dispute can be seen between Jürgen Habermas and Hans Albert in 1963 to 1964. So, there are many appendages of the dispute, but we would be primarily focusing on this genesis, the dispute as it happens in 1961 and where it leads afterwards, what kind of revisiting of science happens. So, what does Karl Popper do in those 27 theses? Very briefly, I am not going to share all the theses with you, but traversing through the 27 theses in his presentation, Karl Popper creates a twist to Socratic idea. And what is the twist? the more we know, the more aware we are of our ignorance. So, this is the twist. If Socratic emphasis was only on ignorance, Popper adds the idea of knowing, and how idea of knowing is actually enabling to be aware of your ignorance. Popper says, and I quote, "Knowledge starts from the tension between knowledge and ignorance." Very simple. The very starting point in the act of knowing is this recognition that there is a tension between knowledge and ignorance. This is true that we start with a problem, something. Problem means there is something in your mind. You start with a problem, that is something of which we are aware. We are aware of this problem. We are aware of something. Most of our social science is about the problem. Most of us try to deal with some problem, and for which we seek to offer solution. Most of the social science is all about finding a problem and offering a solution. These fundamentals prepare the ground for Popper to deliver the most important thesis, that is thesis number 6 in the list of 27 theses. And what is that 26th thesis? That the solution for problems in social sciences are provisional and conjectural, and based on the method of trial and error, which undergo a process of criticism, attempts at refutation. Interesting. I repeat, the 6th thesis suggests that the solution for problems in social sciences are provisional, meaning temporary, for this time being, and conjectural, meaning it involves guesswork, and based on method of trial and error, which means any formulaic way is not going to work. It's trial and error. Try and find out whether it is right or wrong. It can be right, it can be wrong, but we can't start with this assumption that it has to be right. So, provisional, conjectural, method of trial and error, and it undergoes a process of criticism. Criticism means attempts at refutation. Let there be several attempts to refute this solution that one has offered through trial and error method, solution which is provisional in nature, solution which involves a lot of conjecturing. Let there be a lot of criticism, let there be attempts at refutation, and that is the only way in which a piece of knowledge in science can be credible. It can earn its credibility if it goes through the process of criticism, attempts at refutation. In Popper's own word, and I quote, "The so-called objectivity of science lies in the objectivity of critical method." This means, above all, that no theory is beyond attack by criticism, and further, that the main argument of logical criticism, the logical contradiction, is objective. So, just in case we tend to take the word objectivity as a fetish which will make your work scientific, just in case objectivity has become the most dominant fetish of social sciences, one has to remember this with reference to Karl Popper, that objectivity of social science lies in the objectivity of critical method. There is nothing called objectivity which can be planted anywhere. Objectivity is a process which entails rounds of criticism, rounds of attempts at refutation. Anyways, following Popper's presentation, the dispute that we are referring to came into shape. Though both Popper sorry, and Adorno seemed to be in agreement about a wide array of issues, including the problem of science, they both agreed that science is problematic. They both agreed on the critique of scientism. They both were not very comfortable with science's belief in its own supremacy, its supreme ability. They were both critical. They both agreed on the idea that nature of social science is problematic. They both agreed that there is a slippery domain of relativism in sociology of knowledge, which takes us to some kind of subjective tangent altogether. They both agreed on these things. However, Adorno, in the light of the basic principle of Frankfurt School, to which I just a while ago referred, the basic principle of Frankfurt School, which was flagged by Horkheimer in his directorial address in 1931, and the general philosophical orientation of the Frankfurt School. In that light, Adorno sought to differ on one ground, saying, and I quote Adorno, saying, "For Popper, a problem is something merely epistemological, and for me, at the same time, it is something practical." This may appear very simple interjection from Adorno, but it is very powerful. For Popper, a problem is something merely epistemological, and for me, at the same time, it is something practical. Extremely political statement it is. The intellectual politics of Frankfurt School gets revealed in this one sentence. What was Adorno doing? He underlined as a seminal problem, he underlined that science or social sciences cannot be separated from reality by any stretch of philosophical rumination. No amount of philosophical sophistry can prove that my questions and my answer to those questions are merely formulations in abstraction. No, they are related to the concrete world, they are related to the practical world, they are not epistemological jugglery of a philosopher. Adorno is trying to highlight something extremely significant for social sciences. The epistemological problems since Bacon, Francis Bacon, René Descartes, and all those Enlightenment rationalists, the epistemological problems since them have been trimmed according to the conception of science. According to the framework of scientific epistemology, they have been trimmed to befit the framework of scientific epistemology. They have been trimmed. They do not reflect actual process of cognition. Likewise, Popper's idea, so this is one point rebuttal or course correction that Adorno is offering for Popper, that it is high time that we step down from the higher pedestal of a philosopher from where one tries to epistemologize everything. Everything about real world we are offering through epistemology. Our engagement with the real world is poor while we are trying to make our epistemology rich. Likewise, there is also a criticism on another round, another level. It says that Popper's idea of criticism, an essential characteristic of critical rationalism in an open society, is merely an epistemological pursuit. It assumes a lot of things. Popper assumes a lot of things while recommending critical rationalism. He assumes that society is truly an open society. In such an imagined open society, this epistemological pursuit, namely criticism, critical rationalism requires debate. Facts and knowledge for Adorno are mediated through society. Hence, he suggests that not all theorems are hypotheses. I am quoting Adorno. He suggests that not all theorems are hypotheses. Theory is the telos, not the vehicle of sociology. Not all theorems are hypotheses. Theory is the telos, not the vehicle of sociology. And moreover, by emphasizing the significance of criticism in science, according to Adorno, Popper has done a service to dialectician. First of all, theory is made to be a point of discussion, not that all theorems would become hypotheses, not that theory is an end by itself in sociology, it is a vehicle. It is not the vehicle, theory is a telos, theory is not everything that drives in sociology, but it is a telos from where one can look at stuff. And moreover, by emphasizing the significance of criticism in science, according to Adorno, Popper has done a service to dialectician. What does it mean? Basically means that the dialectic character of science is what critical theory, a critique of society, would overemphasize. In Adorno's return to dialectic, reality, the object of societal knowledge, is not imperative free. Scientific objectivity and value freedom are themselves values in this dialectical framework of Adorno. Hence, separation of evaluative and value free behavior is false insofar as they are reifications. Reality is a totality that demands critical theory to defy the academic division of labor, according to which sociologists shall not engage with psychological. This Adorno is the whole of Frankfurt School is in a way it subscribes to this academic division of labor, which does not allow a sociologist to be, in today's phrase one can say, to be adequately interdisciplinary. In the scheme of dialectic, it is difficult to maintain such boundaries, such division of labor that eventually sustains the autarky of science. Instead, it is necessary to bring back the Hegelian dialectic, and by doing so, critical theory centers on the idea of speculation, which had started to resemble the Faustian cliche of the beast on the barren heath. These are the words of Adorno. The idea of the critical theory centers on the idea of speculation. Why speculation? Because it was made to appear like the Faustian cliche of the beast on the barren heath. Since the collapse of Hegelian system in popular discourse, the idea of speculation earned its notoriety, which was also supported by a predominant variety of scientific epistemology and its social science cognate named positivism. And with such a bare minimum methodological imperative, Adorno suggests to get back to the dignity of objects. In his words, dignity of objects rather than the objectivity of the findings, quote unquote. He wants to bring back the dignity of objects rather than the objectivity of the findings. One can understand how problematic the word objectivity becomes in the larger framework of Adorno's discussion. The debate known as positivism dispute in German sociology aids in developing a dialectical sociology alongside critical rationalism of Popper. Cut.
छोटा कर.
So, to end this part of lecture number 5, we would briefly acknowledge that the dispute has paved the way to critically revisit science, and it is not surprising therefore that in history of science, in philosophy of science, there emerged several kind of voices in engagement with Karl Popper's thesis. In the light of this dispute, it is important therefore to think of Thomas Kuhn, Paul Feyerabend, Imre Lakatos and others who deliver in Anglo-American philosophy. They are all responding to Popper, though not with the stance that is central in the dispute in German sociology. They are, however, sharing the fundamental idea that science ought to be revisited in order to develop a sense of a science that is non-innocent, theory loaded and plagued by rivaling hypotheses. In the next lecture, we will return to Thomas Kuhn, Paul Feyerabend, Imre Lakatos in the main. Thank you.